Sean Hannity's voice cut through the studio like a thunderclap, sharp, insistent, dripping with a smug certainty. "Congresswoman Crockett, you owe the American people an apology." The lights bore down, hot and merciless, cameras capturing every flicker of expression, every twitch of discomfort they hoped to find on her face. The audience shifted, restless, caught between anticipation and disbelief, waiting to see if the demand would land like a hammer or backfire like a spark in dry grass. Hannity leaned forward, his tone more command than question, echoing through the airwaves into living rooms across the nation. The set felt less like a debate table and more like a courtroom where he styled himself as judge, jury, and executioner. The tension was thick enough to choke on, the kind of moment where millions held their breath, convinced they were about to witness a forced submission, a political kneel. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She sat poised, shoulders squared, her eyes locked on Hannity with the steady focus of someone who had weathered storms far fiercer than this. Silence lingered for a beat too long, the kind of silence that turns into spectacle, stretching nerves like taut strings. The camera zoomed tighter, hunting for hesitation, for any trace of retreat. They found none. Instead, Crockett's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. Not arrogance, not fear, but composure. A calm rooted in something deeper than politics, something Hannity couldn't touch. The audience sensed it before a word was spoken. That this wasn't going to be the surrender he demanded. This was the calm before a storm that would sweep beyond the studio walls. In that breathless pause, viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, scrolling fingers frozen midair on phones, waiting for what came next. What could she possibly say? How could she stand against the machine pressing her to the wall? And then, just as Hannity prepared to press his demand again, Crockett leaned ever so slightly into the microphone. The world seemed to contract, sound falling away, cameras trembling to capture every second. No one expected her next words, to not only silence the room but ignite a firestorm across America. The moment Sean Hannity demanded that apology was more than just a question. It was a gauntlet thrown down in front of the entire nation. This wasn't a quiet policy discussion or a polite back and forth. It was a high-stakes standoff under the blinding lights of live television where every second, every syllable, could ripple across America before the cameras even cooled. For Hannity, the tactic was clear. He wanted to corner Jasmine Crockett, to force her into a position of submission. In his world, demanding an apology wasn't about accountability, it was about dominance. By framing her as someone who had wronged the American people, he turned himself into their proxy, weaponizing his platform and legacy of bluster. In that instant, he wasn't asking Crockett to simply retract a statement. He was demanding she bow to his authority, to admit fault in front of millions, and in doing so, to legitimize his framing of the debate. The atmosphere in the studio reflected that tension. You could hear the nervous coughs of producers off camera, the rustle of audience members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Hannity's followers expected a victory moment, a soundbite that would trend, a clip they could blast across social media with triumphant captions, "Crockett folds." But those who truly understood the weight of the exchange knew this moment was about much more than an apology. It was about who controls the narrative in American politics, who gets to define patriotism, dignity, and truth. For progressive viewers watching from afar, Hannity's demand didn't just sting. It echoed decades of silencing tactics used against voices who dared to challenge the status quo. For Crockett, acquiescing wasn't just unthinkable. It was impossible. And yet the stakes extended beyond personal pride. This was happening at a moment when the political atmosphere in America was supercharged, when debates about race, justice, and democracy weren't confined to chambers or committee hearings. They were spilling into streets, onto timelines, into classrooms and dinner tables. To let Hannity's demand go unchallenged would be to allow history to repeat itself. Powerful men using volume and bravado to drown out the voices of women, of truth-tellers, of disruptors. Hannity smirked, sensing he had her pinned. The confidence of a man who had played this role countless times before, pressing, pushing, extracting the headline he wanted. But his overconfidence was his weakness, because Crockett wasn't just another guest trying to survive the fire. She was a fighter shaped by courtrooms, committee hearings, and communities that had tested her resolve far more brutally than any primetime ambush. She sat there, measured, absorbing not just his words, but the symbolism behind them. And she knew this was no longer about Sean Hannity. This was about something larger. About every viewer who had ever been told to apologize for speaking truth, for standing up, for existing with dignity. Hannity wanted a victory clip. What he was about to get was a moment so explosive it would ricochet across platforms, flood hashtags, and redefine the entire confrontation. Because Crockett wasn't about to let history be twisted. Not Ruth Bader Ginsburg's legacy, not the Constitution, and certainly not her own voice. The silence stretched. Hannity leaned closer, almost certain she would cave. But he had no idea. Jasmine Crockett was about to rewrite the script he thought he controlled. To understand the full weight of that confrontation, you have to understand Sean Hannity, not just as a broadcaster, but as a figure who has thrived on turning conflict into theater. For decades, he has built his empire on the art of provocation, on being the loudest voice in the room, on weaponizing his platform to drown out dissent. His audience doesn't tune in for nuance. They tune in for battle. And Hannity, the self-styled general of conservative outrage, is always ready to deliver. On this night, his strategy was classic Hannity. He came armed not with humility or curiosity, but with righteous indignation. The demand for an apology wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated. He knew his viewers craved the spectacle of dominance. They wanted to see him corner a progressive voice, force them into a defensive crouch, and then declare victory before the credits rolled. To Hannity, Crockett was just the latest opponent in an endless series of takedowns, another character in his script of us versus them. But beneath the performance lies the contradiction that makes this moment so volatile. Hannity often cloaks himself in the language of justice, patriotism, and tradition. He cites the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, even icons like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when it suits his narrative. Yet when those same principles are invoked to hold power accountable, to protect the marginalized, or to defend the voiceless, Hannity pivots. Justice becomes partisan, patriotism becomes radical, truth becomes agenda, and that was the hypocrisy on display the night he demanded Crockett's apology. Here was a man who has repeatedly framed himself as the defender of free speech, now seeking to silence it. A man who invokes the legacy of American heroes, now twisting their words into weapons against the very causes they championed. He wasn't defending Ginsburg's ideals. He was appropriating them, using her name as a shield while dismantling the values she spent her life advancing. For Hannity, this wasn't new. His career has been marked by these moments. The fiery interruptions, the condescending smirks, the certainty that his voice is the final word. He has sparred with presidents, activists, academics, always framing himself as the arbiter of truth, even when his arguments collapse under scrutiny. But what makes his tactics dangerous is the megaphone he commands. Millions of viewers hear not just his opinions, but his framing of reality, and that power, unchecked, can distort even the clearest truths. That night, his arrogance was palpable. He leaned on his desk with the confidence of a man who has seen opponents stumble before. His voice carried the cadence of certainty, punctuated with rhetorical flourishes designed to corner Crockett. He wanted her trapped between two impossible options: apologize and appear weak, or refuse and risk being painted as disrespectful, ungrateful, even un-American. To Hannity, it was a win-win scenario. Either way, he would claim the moral high ground, but arrogance blinds. What Hannity underestimated was Crockett's ability to see through the trap, to turn the very stage he set into her own platform. He underestimated her composure, her understanding of history, and her refusal to let hypocrisy go unchallenged. While he saw himself as the puppeteer, pulling the strings of the exchange, Crockett was quietly gathering the threads he didn't realize he'd left dangling. And this is where the true irony lies. Hannity, a man who built his brand on exposing contradictions in others, was now the contradiction personified. He stood there demanding justice while perpetuating injustice. He invoked Ginsburg while mocking her spirit. He claimed authority on behalf of the people while silencing one of their elected representatives. It was arrogance, pure and simple, the kind that always invites downfall. For the audience watching, the cracks were visible even before Crockett spoke. The smug grin, the overconfident demand, the lack of self-awareness. It was the performance of a man so sure of victory he didn't notice the tide shifting beneath him. His attempt to frame Crockett as the antagonist only revealed him as the true villain of the exchange. And that's the setup of this story. A broadcaster at the height of his arrogance, convinced of his dominance, unaware that the very stage he built would soon become the platform for his undoing. What he thought would be a routine moment of control was about to spiral into a cultural flashpoint, one where his own contradictions would be laid bare, not by force, but by the calm, cutting clarity of his opponent, because Hannity's demand was never really about justice. It was about control, and in trying to seize it, he set the stage for the moment that would shatter his illusion of power. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's response carried such force, you have to know the road she walked to that moment. Because Crockett didn't arrive in that studio as a politician rehearsing talking points. She came as a fighter who had already battled through struggles most of her critics couldn't begin to imagine. Long before she sparred with Hannity, Crockett was a young black woman navigating the sharp edges of America's legal system, not from a place of privilege, but from the side of those who often lacked power. She had seen what injustice looked like up close. She had defended the voiceless, faced down systemic barriers, and carved out space in rooms that were never designed for her to enter. Every victory was earned. Every loss left lessons etched into her character. Her journey began with law, but not law as an abstraction. For Crockett, law was lived. She worked as a public defender, standing beside clients who had no one else in their corner. She saw how the scales of justice tilted, how those with money and influence played by different rules. And she refused to look away. Where others found despair, she found fuel. Her courtroom presence wasn't just about defending cases. It was about demanding dignity. That sense of fight, of speaking up even when the odds leaned heavy, became her calling card. But Crockett's story isn't just about her career. It's about identity. As a black woman in America, she carried with her the knowledge that every room she stepped into would test her twice. Once for her ideas, and again for daring to exist in spaces where her presence was itself a disruption. She knew the looks, the dismissive interruptions, the way critics tried to box her in. And yet she refused to shrink. Instead, she sharpened her voice. She leaned into her identity, not as a liability, but as a source of unshakable strength. That identity became inseparable from her politics. When she entered Congress, Crockett wasn't just another lawmaker. She was a representative who carried the grit of the courtroom into the halls of power. She spoke with the urgency of someone who had lived the consequences of broken systems. Her speeches weren't sterile recitations of policy. They were alive, personal, pulsing with the weight of real lives at stake. That authenticity, raw and unvarnished, set her apart. It also drew fire. Opponents tried to paint her as combative, unpolished, too much. They framed her passion as disrespect, her truth as radicalism. And yet, what they called defiance, her supporters called courage. Because every time Crockett stood up, she wasn't just defending herself, she was defending those who rarely had a seat at the table. And here's where the connection to Ruth Bader Ginsburg becomes more than symbolic. Like RBG, Crockett understood the power of dissent. She knew that calm persistence could move mountains just as surely as fiery speeches could shake ceilings. RBG fought her battles in the measured tones of legal briefs. Crockett fought hers in the fiery rhythms of televised exchanges. Different styles, same essence. Both women turned resistance into legacy. By the time Hannity demanded his apology, Crockett had already weathered storms fiercer than a cable news confrontation. She had debated with prosecutors who underestimated her. She had stood before judges who doubted her. She had entered politics knowing full well the weight of being underestimated again and again. And yet every time she turned those doubts into proof. Every dismissal became an opening. Every insult became a stage. So when Hannity thought he was cornering her, he was stepping into a trap he couldn't see. Because Crockett's composure wasn't an act. It was the product of years spent mastering the art of patience. Her calm wasn't weakness, it was discipline. The kind of discipline born from knowing that dignity outlasts arrogance. That truth eventually cracks through noise. That the person who holds their ground with conviction always wins more than the person who shouts the loudest. And this is why her response would land with such resonance. She wasn't just countering Hannity's words. She was countering decades of a system that tried to silence women like her. Every syllable carried not just her voice, but the echoes of those who had fought before her, the voices that were too often ignored, the truths too often buried. Her supporters saw it clearly. Crockett was not simply defending herself in that moment. She was embodying the struggle of every person who has ever been told to apologize for daring to speak up. She was the living contradiction to Hannity's arrogance. Where he projected power through dominance, she revealed power through restraint. Where he demanded an apology, she offered none, because her existence, her presence, her persistence were already the answer, and that is why this moment mattered so deeply. For Crockett, it wasn't just another exchange. It was destiny meeting defiance. It was the clash of two Americas, one clinging to arrogance, the other rising with dignity. And as the tension in the studio thickened, as the audience leaned forward waiting for her reply, it became clear this wasn't going to be the apology Hannity expected. This was going to be the turning point no one could forget. The moment Sean Hannity demanded his apology, the studio air shifted. The lights bore down harder. The cameras zoomed closer, and the audience leaned forward in anticipation, sensing they were about to witness something combustible. Hannity's tone wasn't a question, it was an order. His words dripped with authority, as though daring Jasmine Crockett to step out of line. "Congresswoman," Hannity snapped, "are you going to apologize right now, on this program, to me and to the American people, for your reckless words?" A hush followed, the kind of silence that only exists in a live broadcast when the stakes are nuclear. For a moment, the only sound was the faint buzz of studio equipment, the shuffling of note cards, and the nervous cough of someone in the back row. Crockett didn't flinch. Her body language told its own story. She sat tall, her shoulders squared, eyes fixed squarely on Hannity. Outwardly, she appeared calm, collected, almost statuesque. But beneath that composure, you could sense the simmer, the unspoken fire. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tapped once against the desk, then stilled. She was steady, deliberate, every motion signaling that she would not be rushed, not be shaken. Hannity smirked, mistaking her silence for surrender. He leaned back in his chair, puffed up with smug confidence. "That's what I thought," he quipped, earning a few scattered chuckles from his supporters in the audience. His voice took on the mocking rhythm of a man who believed the battle was already won. But Crockett's supporters weren't laughing. From the other side of the room came murmurs, low, charged, restless. The tension between the two camps was palpable, like an electrical current coursing through the studio. Every word, every pause, every gesture carried weight far beyond the set. Hannity pressed harder. "You see, this is the problem with politicians like you. No accountability, no respect, just excuses and division. If you were half the leader you claim to be, you'd admit you were wrong and say sorry. But you won't, will you?" The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. He was baiting her, pushing her toward a corner, hoping she'd lash out in frustration. His grin widened, eyes glinting with the arrogance of someone who had played this game many times before. Still, Crockett remained unmoved. She folded her hands on the desk in front of her, chin tilting just slightly upward, an almost imperceptible gesture of defiance. It was the kind of body language that says, "I'm not on your time. You're on mine," and then it happened. A ripple of sound, first soft, then growing, swept through the audience. Some were whispering to their neighbors. Others gasped outright, sensing the turn before it arrived. Even the crew behind the cameras seemed to shift uneasily, as though bracing for impact. Hannity raised an eyebrow, pretending not to notice, though the smugness in his grin hardened into something more forced. His voice grew louder, faster, as if volume could drown out the crackling energy filling the room. "So that's it? Nothing to say? The people are watching, Congresswoman. They see your silence as weakness." Crockett leaned forward at last. Slowly, deliberately, her hands slid closer to the microphone, fingertips brushing the metal frame. The audience froze. Hannity froze. Even the cameramen instinctively zoomed in tight on her face. The studio fell utterly silent. No murmurs, no coughs, no shuffling papers. Just stillness. Crockett's eyes locked on Hannity's, unblinking. She inhaled once, then lowered her mouth to the mic. The anticipation was unbearable. Viewers at home could almost hear their own hearts pounding. What was she about to say? Would she bend? Would she break? Would she deliver the apology Hannity demanded? Or something else entirely? And then, just before she spoke, the feed seemed to stretch time itself. Her pause was longer than anyone expected. It was masterful, deliberate, a silence weaponized. She knew the power of patience, the art of letting arrogance collapse under its own weight. The cliffhanger was complete. Hannity leaned forward, ready to pounce. The audience held its collective breath. And Crockett, inches from the mic, finally opened her mouth, her first word cutting through the quiet like a blade. What she said next would not just silence the room. It would ignite a firestorm across America. Her voice broke the silence like thunder rolling across a still sky. Low at first, steady, controlled. "Mr. Hannity," she began, her tone sharp enough to slice through the tension. "You don't get to demand anything from me. Not tonight. Not ever." The studio gasped, an audible wave sweeping across the crowd. Hannity blinked, stunned, his smirk faltering for the first time all evening. The cameras tightened their focus, catching every flicker of his reaction, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the narrowing of his eyes. He had demanded submission. Instead, he had been handed defiance. Crockett leaned into the mic, her words crisp, unhurried, each syllable dropping like a hammer. "You stand here asking for an apology as if you represent some higher moral ground. But let's be clear, you don't speak for the American people. You speak for ratings, for outrage, for division. And the truth is, America is tired of it," the audience erupted. Cheers, applause, shouts of agreement echoed through the studio, drowning out the faint groans of Hannity's supporters. For a moment, Hannity tried to cut in, waving his hand and raising his voice, but his words were lost under the swell of reaction. It wasn't just Crockett speaking, it was as though the audience had found their voice through her. She waited, calm, collected, allowing the noise to crest and fade before continuing. That patience was power. It forced Hannity to sit there, powerless, his demand for control unraveling with each passing second. Crockett's eyes locked on him again. "You want me to say sorry because I dared to call out the hypocrisy, the cruelty, the endless stream of fear you peddle every night? You want an apology for telling the truth? Sean, the only people who deserve an apology are the millions of Americans who've had to endure being treated like outsiders in their own country because of voices like yours." The words landed like a gut punch. The camera cut to Hannity's face, his jaw tightening, his knuckles white against the desk. He tried to interject, but Crockett wasn't finished. She raised a hand, not in aggression, but in command. "Let me remind you who I am. I come from a community you've dismissed, a story you've ignored, a people you've belittled, and I don't apologize for standing tall in that truth. I don't apologize for being unapologetically black, unapologetically a woman, unapologetically American." Gasps turned into cheers. Some in the audience stood, clapping, chanting her name. The studio wasn't just alive, it was on fire. Hannity's attempt to regain ground grew frantic. "This isn't about race. This isn't about identity. This is about your words, Congresswoman. You insulted millions of Americans and you owe them an apology." Crockett's laugh was soft but devastating, the kind that slices arrogance into ribbons. "Millions of Americans? Or just you, Sean? Because it sounds like what you really want is for me to make you feel comfortable, to reassure you that your power, your platform, your ego remain untouched." The crowd roared, and even through the television screen, viewers could feel the tide turning. Hannity's demand was no longer the center of the story. Crockett was. She leaned back slightly, her voice now carrying the rhythm of a preacher delivering a sermon. "The truth is, this country doesn't move forward when women like me apologize for existing, for speaking, for calling out what needs to be called out. It moves forward when we refuse to bow, when we refuse to let arrogance masquerade as authority." Every phrase struck like lightning. The cadence pulled listeners deeper, giving them not just a counter-argument, but a vision, a rallying cry. Hannity, visibly rattled, stammered, "So you admit." But the sentence collapsed under Crockett's next line. "Admit what? That I struck a nerve? That I said out loud what too many are afraid to? Sean, your demand for an apology says more about your fragility than my words ever could, and America sees it. They see through the theatrics, the bluster, the constant need to silence anyone who dares to disagree." A woman in the front row stood and clapped hard, her voice cutting through the applause. "Tell him, Jasmine." The chant caught fire, spreading through the room until it seemed the entire studio was on its feet. Hannity shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that the moment was slipping beyond his grasp. His demand, once sharp and commanding, now looked pitiful in the face of Crockett's unyielding poise. Crockett delivered the finishing blow with surgical precision. "So no, Sean, I will not apologize to you. Not for speaking truth, not for standing in my skin, in my history, and my power. If you want an apology, you'll have to look somewhere else. Because what I offer tonight is not regret, it's a reminder. A reminder that this country belongs to all of us. And no amount of shouting, no smug demand will ever change that. The audience exploded. Applause thundered through the walls, chants echoing as though the studio itself had joined the movement. Hannity sat stiffly, his attempt at a smirk now little more than a grimace. The cameras lingered on his face, catching the cracks in his armor, and just when it seemed the moment couldn't peak any higher, Crockett added one final line, her voice calm, resolute, unforgettable. I'm not here to soothe fragile egos. I'm here to fight for dignity, for justice, for the America we deserve. The studio erupted once more, the crowd chanting her name louder, the energy spilling beyond the stage and into the world beyond the cameras. What began as a demand for an apology had become something far greater, a defining moment. A mic drop that would ripple far beyond that studio, searing itself into headlines, timelines, and history itself. And as the chants thundered, the world watching at home knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of the firestorm. When the applause and hashtags began to fade into the background, what remained was the essence of the moment itself. It wasn't just that Jasmine Crockett had stood her ground. It was how she had done it. With dignity so unshakable, it turned an attempted humiliation into a lesson the nation couldn't ignore. Crockett could have shouted. She could have matched Hannity's demand with rage or venom. But instead she chose calm. That calm smile, that steady voice, that refusal to let arrogance dictate the terms, that was what elevated the confrontation from a clash of egos to a moral parable. In a country too often drowning in noise, her restraint spoke louder than any insult ever could. Ruth Bader Ginsburg once said, "Real change, enduring change, happens one step at a time." Crockett embodied that philosophy in real time. She didn't break the moment with fury. She bent it with composure. Her choice to resist on her own terms turned Hannity's demand into his downfall. The deeper truth resonated far beyond the stage lights. Dignity, Crockett reminded us, is not weakness. It is strength. It is the refusal to bow when someone tries to reduce you. It is the quiet thunder of knowing your worth and letting the world see it. Hannity's attempt to claim power by extracting an apology only underscored how little true power he had when faced with someone who would not surrender. And there was something undeniably American in that. This country, at its best, has always celebrated those who refuse to apologize for their existence. Immigrants who came with nothing but built futures, workers who stood against impossible odds, women who spoke when told to be silent. Crockett's stand was not just about her. It was about every voice that had ever been told. Sit down, stay quiet, be sorry for who you are. Her reply echoed across those lives like a promise. You do not owe an apology for existing. You do not owe an apology for belonging. And when someone demands one, the most powerful answer is to stand taller, speak clearer, and let dignity dismantle arrogance. That was the real lesson. Not the memes, not the headlines, but the clarity that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it simply refuses to bend. And in that refusal, the arrogant unravel themselves. For those watching, especially young viewers searching for examples of strength that didn't mimic cruelty, the impact was profound. Crockett had shown that you could be fiery without being vicious, unyielding without being cruel, powerful without being loud. She proved that true authority doesn't come from domination. It comes from authenticity. The image of Hannity's scowl against Crockett's calm smile will linger, not because of what was said in that moment, but because of what it revealed. Arrogance is fragile when confronted with dignity. One demands submission, the other inspires respect. One collapses under scrutiny, the other endures. As the country replayed the clip, Crockett's words were etched into a larger narrative, that justice doesn't live in the mouths of those who scream for apologies. It lives in the actions of those who refuse to give them away cheaply. It lives in the composure to stand, unbowed, when the weight of expectation tries to force you down. In the end, the confrontation became something bigger than television drama. It became a reminder of what America can be when truth is spoken not as an echo of the past, but as the voice we carry forward. Ginsburg lit the path. Crockett walked it. And in doing so, she left the nation not just with a viral clip, but with a moral compass. Dignity is not negotiable. And as that realization settled in, one final thought lingered, a thought that turned the lesson into a movement, and the movement into a call. So when the lights dimmed and the headlines were written, the story wasn't really about Sean Hannity's demand. It was about Jasmine Crockett's answer. Her calm smile, her unwavering gaze, her refusal to bow. Those are the moments that outlive the broadcast. They are the snapshots that etch themselves into history, the ones people point to years later and say, that was when the tide turned. The title of this story says it all. Hannity demanded an apology. But what he got instead was a lesson. Crockett showed the nation that strength is not in the volume of your voice, but in the truth of your words. She reminded America that when arrogance demands submission, dignity replies with power. And that's why this moment went viral. Not just because it was dramatic, not just because it was explosive, but because it was undeniably human. People saw themselves in Crockett's calm. They saw the courage they wanted to claim for their own lives. They saw what it looks like when history doesn't just echo, it evolves. If you believe in that kind of dignity, if you believe in leaders who don't bend to arrogance but rise above it, then don't let this moment fade into the scroll of yesterday's feed. Share it, talk about it, carry it forward, because justice isn't just the memory of the past. It is the voice we choose to carry into the future. And tonight, that voice sounded like Jasmine Crockett's. And the question left for all of us is simple. When arrogance demands your silence, will you apologize, or will you stand?